This episode will focus on the promised land. People assume that this promise of a promised homeland was made by God to the Israelites when facilitating Moses to lead them out of captivity in Egypt. But according to ancient Jewish texts, it's much more interesting than that. Hello folks, welcome to the 30th episode of the Quintology Files. You'll be pleased maybe that this time we're back on terra firma after our rather exploratory discussions over the last few weeks. We referred to many of the ancient gods of Middle East cultures in the previous couple of episodes. For more information on this and the relationship between them, you can consult the website, which is www.quintologypublications.com, where you will find the genealogy of all the key Middle Eastern deities. Thank you. This episode will focus on the Promised Land, the origin of the term, and why it was so important to the history of the Levant. People assume that this promise of a promised homeland was made by God to the Israelites when facilitating Moses to lead them out of captivity in Egypt. But according to ancient Jewish texts, it's much more interesting than that. The story of the Promised Land is only obliquely referenced in Genesis, with a rather odd story about Ham's sons seeing their father naked. Bizarrely, this then leads to an odd curse. Not sure why any curse is actually even called for. And that's not explained. Even more bizarre is that the punishment is not collective across the sons, but is only on one son, Canaan. And then, actually, it's not even Canaan that is cursed, but Canaan's descendants, his unborn offspring. Theologians have no explanation for this conundrum. According to Genesis, after the flood, the newly emergent lands were allocated between the families of the three sons of Noah. There's no mention of what Noah himself got. Ham got Africa, Seth got Mesopotamia, and Japheth got Europe. Neither God nor Noah seemed to think laterally. What about the rest of the world? But the real story of the Promised Land may be found in the Book of Jubilees, not a generally recognised book in Jewish scripture, but one that's actually quoted by Jesus. Indeed, its importance is shown by the many copies held by the Essenes and recovered amongst the Dead Sea Scrolls. When Ham set off from Mount Ararat in Turkey, supposedly for Africa, he naturally travelled down the Way of Horus, that very ancient route along the eastern seaboard of the Mediterranean. This route took them along the coast of modern Lebanon, where one son, Canaan, gawped at the corniche and the magnificent stands of cedar. And he then announced, I'm going to cut out the convoy and I'm going to settle down here. His father, Ham, and all his other brothers warned him not to. They said great strife would come from his unwise decision, which broke the ruling of the gods. They warned Canaan that the land he was taking was promised land, promised to the seed of Shem, and his seed would be forever cursed and enslaved by the seed of Shem. However, Canaan was headstrong and went ahead with his decision. Hence, thousands of years later, when the Lord of Seven, the Lord of planet Earth, Enlil, also known as El Elyon, visited Abraham in Haran and told him to go into Canaan and take back the promised land. Now, Abraham, a very highly educated prince of Sumer, knew all about this history, of course, and he just said, "Yep, boss, I'm on it." Thus, a clear explanation may be found in the Book of Jubilees, and I find it strange that theologians persist in the obvious nonsense explanation written in Genesis. Again, as we discussed in a previous episode, there seems to be much commonality between the activities and requirements of Yahweh and the so-called pagan gods of the Middle East. So, as many take the biblical accounts of Yahweh as truthful, I think we should at least consider some of the accounts of pagan gods and see if they were equally believable. I understand many will resile from any thought that we might give balance in treatment of the biblical God and the pagan gods, for which, from an early childhood, we are taught to use derogatory labels, such as pagan and idols. But when you look closely at biblical texts and at other historical evidence, you keep finding that all the peoples of the Middle East were convinced their gods ruled over territories divinely allocated by an ultimate sky god.
So, tell us how these godly instructions to recover the promised land turned out.
The mission for Abraham and his descendants was to reoccupy the land promised by El Elyon, the Lord Almighty, to Shem and his descendants, but wrongly colonized by Canaan. What we know of the real history of the millennia requires a complete rewrite of the biblical account. According to Genesis, Abraham, finding the promised land ruled by Egypt, went down to stay with the Pharaoh, maybe lent him his sister wife, Sarai, and eventually wandered back to found the modern country of Israel. At face value, this sounds bizarre. Abraham, commanded by God to occupy the promised land, goes completely off mission and wanders down to Egypt, where for some reason he's taken in by the Pharaoh, no less, and lives a life of luxury at court, with Genesis reporting that his wealth multiplied rapidly. But some important details are missing from the account in Genesis. Firstly, that the promised land at this time was part of the Egyptian Empire. And secondly, that his wife, Sarai, was a sister of the ruling Pharaoh. These facts change Abraham's odd behavior into perhaps a master strategy. Did Abraham hope to trade Sarai for the promised land? Or perhaps, having lost his inheritance of the capital province of Ur, did he hope to become uncle to the next Pharaoh? Remember, in those days, wives were chattels and easily tradable. And he had a good card. I hope this not made anyone choke on their toast. The last statement is based on ancient Talmudic references that uniquely identify the Pharaoh that Abraham stayed with, and why. To modern readers, it sounds weird that when the Pharaoh admires his wife, Abraham claims, "She's my sister." Christian pastors often claim this was a shameful lie, showing Abraham was a weak man, despite being hand-picked by God to be the founder of a great nation. That's absolute poppycock. In fact, even according to Genesis, Sarai was Abraham's sister, most specifically his sister by another mother, thereby qualifying as his most senior wife. Marrying your half-sister was a common prerogative of ruling families, mandatory amongst Egyptian royalty. Much more important was that Sarai was also sister by another mother to the Pharaoh, therefore eligible to be his most senior wife. This may be news to many viewers, but comes from ancient Midrash and Talmudic traditions, and as we shall see, makes much more sense than the traditional explanation. Same as with the curse on Canaan's descendants we just talked about. Now, Abraham's father, Terah, had at least 2 wives, Towait, who was the mother of Sarai, and Yanu, the mother of Abraham. Jewish sources, including the Midrash and texts from the Dead Sea Scrolls, identified Towait as Infri Tar Juanan, the widow of Pharaoh Amenemhat I. Her son, by this marriage, was the next Pharaoh, Senuseret I. This meant Sarai was Senureset's maternal half-sister, as well as Abraham's paternal half-sister. Sarai, Abraham's wife, was half-sister to Pharaoh Senuseret, the daughter of Terah, Abraham's father, and Towait, Nefrin Tar Dejinan, the former wife of a deceased Pharaoh, Amenemhat I. Senuseret, recognizing Sarai as his half-sister, would have leapt at the chance to maintain the highest purity for his bloodline. It was standard practice for pharaohs to marry their half-sisters to progress the kingship through the female line. Genesis 12:18-19 enigmatically records the Pharaoh saying to Abraham, "What have you done to me? Why did you not tell me she is your wife? Why did you say she is my sister so that I took her to be my wife?" Christian teaching is that Sarai was 80 years old. That's actually a simple mistranslation. In Hebrew, the formula is not 40 plus 40 years, but 40 years, which is supported by Genesis 12 verses 14-16, where the Pharaoh's officials brief the Pharaoh before Sarai arrives, telling him she is very beautiful. That seems unlikely if she was 80 years old.
So can you summarize for us what you think were the true circumstances?
Yeah. Firstly, Abraham knew Egypt ruled all of the so-called Promised Land, a fact that's absent from Genesis. Secondly, Abraham, well educated, knew all about his wife's blood link with the Pharaoh, again, absent from Genesis. Thirdly, his best chance to recover the Promised Land would be through exploiting Sarai. Indeed, both Jewish and Muslim sources indicate that Isaac's father was the Pharaoh, and that Ishmael, not Isaac, was the putative sacrifice described as Abraham's only son. Finally, Abraham's actions, taking Sarai to see the Pharaoh, who being her brother by another mother, made her eligible to be Pharaoh's primary wife. Telling the Pharaoh that Sarai was his sister may have been a plot to have Pharaoh take Sarai as his senior wife, her issue gain the throne of Egypt, and he become uncle to the next Pharaoh. Compensation for having lost the heirship to the capital province of
That brings some very different aspects. How does it align with other information in Genesis?
Well, it actually helps explain a few things. Sarah's original name, Sarai, meaning princess, it seems an unsuitable name for the wife of a patriarch. So was that the reason it was changed by Yahweh? Or maybe his priests when writing Genesis? Sarai having an Egyptian handmaiden, Hagar, with whom Abraham fathered Ishmael. Thirdly, why upon entering Egypt, Abraham and his family were welcomed and given hospitality by none other than the Pharaoh, Senuseret I. because he was half-brother to Abraham's wife. Fourthly, why Abraham introduced his wife as his sister. In those times, a half-sister was culturally a more senior title than a mere wife. Offspring from a union with a half-sister took precedence over all other issue when it came to inheritance from their father. And finally, why Pharaoh Senureset was interested in Sarai, his half-sister, who could help preserve his bloodline and provide an eligible successor to maintain his dynasty. In fact, Pharaoh Senureset I is recorded as marrying a sister called Neferu, with whom he had a son who became Amenhotep II, as well as a daughter. But the geopolitical results from Abraham's mission are somewhat clouded. True, Abraham and his brother Lot were allowed by the Pharaoh to go and settle in the general area of modern Israel, which was pretty sparsely populated. The account in Genesis tells us that Isaac was fathered by Abraham and Sarai left Egypt with Abraham. But whereas we have original Egyptian inscriptions to translate, the Israelites had no written language until adopting the Phoenician script around 1,000 years later. Oral traditions can memorize names, but often get rather fuzzy on the details. Textual analysis points to the bulk of the Torah only being written in Babylon around 14 centuries after these events took place. So which history would you be more inclined to think was factually accurate? The conventional view is that Abraham fathered only two sons, Ishmael and then Isaac. Not very impressive for the crown prince and the ruler of Ur and the oracle priest. Jewish scripture dismisses Ishmael as the father of Arab nations of Mesopotamia and the eastern Levant, whilst Isaac is the lineal patriarch. But in fact, taking Genesis literally, both Ishmael and Isaac are mixed race Sumerian Egyptian, with neither having any Semitic blood. So there's a few errors in the conventional view. Reverting to the contemporary factual records, these show the Egyptians continued to rule the Promised Land until the meteor airburst in 1650 BC, which destroyed Jericho and Sodom and Gomorrah. This disaster occurred when Egypt was weakened by internecine warfare over succession and allowed hordes of Canaanites and Abraham's Shem descendants fleeing disaster to enter Egypt and occupy Lower Egypt, forming their own state for just over a century. When Egypt pulled itself together once more, strong pharaohs acted to push the Canaanites and the Israelites, which they called the Hyksos, out of Lower Egypt and right across what we call Sinai to what was then called Sinai in northern Arabia. The burning bush incident, where God appears to Moses and tells him he has a new name, Yahweh, may have been written as a device to enable the faithful to pass loyalty on to the next generation, from El Enyon to one of his sons, maybe Sin, also known as the golden calf, who happened to call himself Yahweh to Moses. The temple priests may have invented the story to change God's name, or something may really have occurred whereby mission control for the recovery of the Promised Land was passed down a generation. We also have Ishkur, Sin's younger brother, who had been allocated land that is today Turkey, becoming the principal god of the Hittites. Clearly, the Philistines, previously known as the Sea Peoples, had adopted Ishkur after defeating the Hittites and occupying their land. The Canaanite and Amorite name for Ishkur was Dagon, and we find this name reported in the biblical texts in Judges as the name of the chief deity of the Greek sea peoples. The sea peoples clearly continued the worship of Ishkur as they swept southwards, their campaign ending with defeat by the Egyptians and the absorption into the Egyptian Empire. The sea people settled down, forming the cities of the Pentapolis, today's Gaza Strip. The following 150 years witnessed the slow decline of Egyptian power, and as Egypt's hold over its Asian possessions declined, the strength of those, by then known as the Philistines, grew. The Philistines gradually expanded over the lowland areas of what is today's Israel, effectively isolating the Israelite tribes into two highland areas, the Judean highlands and the Galilean highlands. The control exerted by the Philistines is commented upon in biblical references in this period, recording that the Israelites were allowed to own iron tools such as ploughs, but not weapons. This was enforced by prohibiting the Israelites from operating a smithy. It is written to repair ploughs or reshod horses, the Israelites had to visit Philistine towns. From our vantage point, it seems that Yahweh's younger brother, Ishkur, had to some extent co-opted the invading sea peoples and effectively turned them into a defensive bulwark on the southern flank as protection against Egypt and the descendants of Ham. At the same time, one might have thought that Yahweh, or Sign, had enough on his plate dealing with the rise of Marduk, based in Babylon. From this perspective, it seems both brothers, Yahweh / Shamash and Ishkur, were still pursuing the objective of their father, El Elyon, to recapture the land promised to their family, which had been seized by Canaan. So one might have thought that they would push the Israelites and the Philistines into a powerful coalition, something we touched on in our previous episode. Stepping back, it seems that 8 centuries after Abraham received his marching instructions, the old certainties had dissolved. El Elyon's original instructions to Abraham to recover the land promised to the descendants of Seth, Abraham and his seed were slow to complete the mission. The meteor impact that destroyed both Jericho and Sodom and Gomorrah did lead to a large-scale evacuation of the people of Canaan, along with Abraham's descendants, into Egypt. But a century after this, the Egyptians recovered and expelled those that they called the Hyksos, which appears to have been a combination of the former Canaanites, together with Abraham's descendants, were all expelled from Egypt. At this point, it seems that Abraham was back to square one, with the entire promised land again ruled by Egypt. Meanwhile, in the Mesopotamian heartland of Seth's people, Ra, the overlord of Ham's descendants in Africa, had established himself in Babylon, leading the Amorites under Hammurabi. Ra managed to maintain control under various successive cultures, albeit with a few challenges. In 1595 BC, the Assyrians, loyal to Sign, had swept southwards and defeated Babylon, leaving the city defenseless against marauding Kassites from the east. One wonders, did Ra have a hand in helping the advance of the Egyptian Thutmosis III into Mesopotamia? Because after the Battle of Megiddo in 1457 BC, Assyria and Babylon acknowledged Egyptian suzerainty for more than a century. Meanwhile, it seems that Sin persevered with the Assyrians, genetically still clustered in northeast Syria and northwest Iraq today. And they eventually, in 729, under Tiglath-Pileser, managed to conquer Babylon again, as well as the northern kingdom of Israel, the 10 tribes, and pushed the Philistines out of the lowlands of Samaria. Briefly, until the rise of the Chaldeans, Sin managed to rule, through the Assyrians, most of the lands promised to Seth. The final achievement was to switch the last Chaldean king, Nabonias, to allegiance to Sin. But this was very short-lived, as a few years later we have the Persian and Babylonian records reporting that Ra, as Marduk, led the Persian forces which occupied Babylon. Presumably, under Marduk's direction, Persian forces went on to conquer the entire Promised Land and even Egypt, once again uniting Egypt and Mesopotamia, effectively under the rule of Ra. The descendants of the Most High, El Elyon, were vanquished. Indeed, we've found inscriptions in Haran of Sin briefly visiting for the enthronement of Nabonidus, the last Chaldean king, around 550 BC, where he stated he would never return. If all this talk about Ham and Seth and their ruling gods leaves you a bit cold, just think about the fateful consequences of that decision by Canaan to occupy the lands promised to the descendants of Seth. Given the likelihood that this story is based on some original elements of truth, it most likely dates back around 11,000 years to the aftermath of a major meteor impact. But the Middle East has been a cauldron ever since that. I hope you found this new angle on the history of the Middle East interesting. If you did, please press the like button. Thank you.